I'm Rochelle Akufa with Akiko Fujita. Welcome to our special, The AI Divide, where we'll break down the tumultuous few days for Sam Altman and OpenAI.
Well, Sam Altman, you've probably heard that name a lot in the last year. His company OpenAI dominated the headlines this week after he was fired from one of the most influential startups in the history of Silicon Valley. OpenAI has been the driving force behind generative AI, the technology behind the controversial chatbot ChatGPT. Now, OpenAI didn't invent artificial intelligence, but it did put it on everyone's radar. The organization began as a nonprofit. Its simple stated goal back in 2015 was to, quote, create safe and beneficial AI through a deep understanding of the potential risks and benefits. Now, balancing those risks and benefits has been a matter of hot debate from Silicon Valley to Beijing and beyond. This week, the story boiled over in spectacular fashion. Altman's exit was a big deal. After all, he'd become synonymous with a sweeping global movement. The reasons still are not clear. Officially, the board said he was not consistently candid in his communications, but the bigger narrative suggests there was a division over the speed the company was going and the direction it was taking.
That's right, and reportedly orchestrated by OpenAI's chief scientist, Ilya Sutskever, the move, which he now says he regrets, has been described as both a tragic miscalculation and a messy coup. Now, in the days that followed, Microsoft, by far OpenAI's biggest investor, staged a coup of its own. They hired Altman. Now, he quickly reposted a tweet from CEO Satya Nadella simply saying the mission continues. Microsoft was certainly on one. The tech giant may be the old guard, but OpenAI was more than just an appendage. In short, it seems the two companies really need each other. Microsoft shares jumped in the aftermath, and in the hours that followed, hundreds of Altman's colleagues petitioned to join him. They wanted the board out, or they were heading out. Well, they got what they wanted. Less than a week after he was pushed out, Altman is now back at the helm of OpenAI alongside co-founder Greg Brockman and a new board of directors, including former co-CEO of Salesforce, Bret Taylor, and Larry Summers. Now, the appointment of the former Treasury Secretary has certainly raised some eyebrows. So where to now? Is it a win for OpenAI, for Microsoft? Will Satya Nadella's tech giant look for full control? What about Altman himself? Will he spend the next hour asking these questions and more? Well, to that point, let's get to you, Akiko.
Enthusiasm and investment around AI largely drove the market's gains so far this year, and OpenAI's revolutionary ChatGPT product helped ignite the whirlwind hype. But what is this startup behind the revolutionary technology? It's unique in many ways, perhaps most notably in its unusual corporate structure.
That's right. OpenAI began as a non-profit dedicated to advancing artificial intelligence to, quote, benefit humanity as a whole. In the pursuit of more capital, the company formed a for-profit entity back in 2019, keeping that non-profit board at the helm. The board can act as it deems necessary to protect the mission of the company, like dismissing the CEO. With Altman back in the role and new faces on the board, what does this mean for the future of OpenAI's mission and artificial intelligence as a whole? We're joined now by Amy Webb, Future Today Institute founder and CEO, and Sinan Aral, MIT Professor of Management, Marketing, IT, and Data Science. A big welcome to you both. Sinan, I want to start with you here because people are trying to separate the chaos from the company and the technology. How should they be viewing what has really transpired over these last 5 days?
Thank you for having me, and happy Thanksgiving, early Thanksgiving. I think your summary is very good. I think the OpenAI entity, which began as a nonprofit and then evolved into a nonprofit and a for-profit whose profit was capped, underlies a specific debate that is much more general to AI, which is the debate between safety and concerns for guardrails and developing the technology in a way that reduces harm and risk on one hand, and corporate innovation that is basically focused on developing technology as fast and as efficiently and as widely distributed as possible. And I think that's what you saw boil over on the weekend. There are some reports about individual, debates between personalities, but I think that at the end of the day, the structure of the nonprofit, the company, and the direction of the technology and where Sam Altman wanted to take it, much more innovative, much more quick, much more widely distributed as fast as possible, which is probably also in part what Microsoft is looking for with their investment. And the debate between that and the need for slow, safe development of AI is what you saw boil over on the weekend.
Yeah, Amy, let's pick up on that point, because if you look at what transpired late last night with the new board makeup, with Sam Altman being reinstated, it certainly feels like, on first glance, that the side about entrepreneurs driving the guardrails and driving the innovation has kind of won out in the debate, at least within OpenAI. How do you see it?
Well, I think there are two key points everybody should keep in mind. And the first has to do with calls for safety and regulation within the company. You know, we saw a lot of that over the past year. It's not the first time we've seen CEOs of enormous tech companies going to Congress and other places around the world asking to be regulated. I am sure that there are some folks who are concerned about the development of the tech inside. A lot of this had to do with setting a strategic roadmap for the future, for how to develop that technology. But really what this points to is a serious and salient question we need to start asking around those companies that are developing transformative technologies and how they are governed and managed. The bottom line is that this was a 6-person member board that was very inexperienced, and a 3-headed executive management team that was really caught in the middle of developing technology using basic research and then taking investment. At some point, investors expect a return. So the first point here is, if we expect groundbreaking technologies to be developed, we should be taking a much finer look at how those organizations are managed. And then the second point has to do with where that investment comes from. The United States has stopped funding basic research in critical technologies. Therefore, there will always be a tension between investment in building these critical technologies and investors, I think rightfully so, expecting some type of return. If we don't like the situation that we're currently in, then we need to seek out funding in different places, is the bottom line.
Amy, on the issue of governance, how do you think these companies should be governed? Do the additions of Bret Taylor and Larry Summers on the OpenAI board, does that make you feel any more comfortable with what they're developing?
Well, on the one hand, it does. I think you want mature board members and mature governance because boards really aren't there for the most part as window dressing. They do serve a strategic purpose, and that board's number one priority should be strategic foresight, which is helping the company figure out where do they play and how do they win, but making sure that the public good is front and center, as well as safety, and thinking through long-term implications of the decisions that are being made. But the other thing is that we're approaching AI in a punitive way with regulation. That hasn't worked so far. Regulation is really hard to enforce because it is inherently a look back versus a look forward. The better way forward is to use an incentive structure that compels, in a financial way, companies to make better choices. This is something that has never been tried in the United States before, and I really do think the events that took place over the past few days shows us that we need a different approach going forward.
And Senan, to Amy's point, when you look at the size of the people who are making this decision, this small board here, and you think of the mission of democratizing advanced AI, not wanting it to be in the hands of just a few, does this now fly in the face when you look at the kinds of investors who are really leading the charge here with OpenAI?
Well, I mean, I think that this board is not going to remain 3 members. This board is going to expand to a larger board, a much larger board. I think it's already been clear that Greg and Sam will not be on the board. I think those are concessions that they made upon the deal to come back. And who will be on the board and what the fine-grained details of the board structure will be remains to be seen and is very important. I think 2 things to keep in mind here that are optimistic about the future with regard to these types of technologies is first that safety and profits are ultimately in the long run aligned. So OpenAI does not remain long-term profitable to its maximum potential if it creates safety risks that become public and apparent and create damage and difficulties for the company downstream. But that requires a long-term view. It requires a view that sees developing safety as part of the profit incentive of the company looking long-term. The second thing is democratization is also in line with OpenAI's profit incentive, because ultimately it is a much larger pie if OpenAI is built as a platform company, a platform ecosystem where lots of other third parties can partake in value creation and value appropriation. One company doing it by itself is never going to compete with an ecosystem that has many different players contributing to that ecosystem. We've seen this time and again over the last 2 to 3 decades in tech, and I think this is not something that neither of these 2 points are lost on any board member that would join OpenAI. So I think that there is room for optimism in aligning the incentives, but I agree that these things must be thought about, both in terms of the corporate board structure and its decisions going forward, but also in terms of regulation. You saw President Biden's executive order on AI. It was big and it was bold. The details of enforcement and how that is actually laid out and enforced are really important, and demonstrating an alignment between corporate innovation interests and government regulation as well as safety is crucial.
Amy, do you agree with that point, that safety and profits ultimately are aligned? I mean, it seems like the key question is whether, in fact, they move at the same speed.
Right. Well, I think it depends on whose interpretation of safety you're using. You could argue that right now, a lot of the products that exist from our social media companies are not necessarily safe. And if you look at their numbers, they're doing just fine. I think the challenge when it comes to artificial intelligence, which is a field that I've been a part of now for 2 decades, is that the narratives about AI grossly overshadow what tends to happen in practical terms. We've been living with the idea of walking, talking Terminator-style robots and Skynet-style invisible dragnets intended to take all of our jobs and then murder us in our sleep, that the real safety issues, which in many ways are just much more mundane, get overlooked. We've been talking so much about de-risking the technology in grandiose terms that nobody has talked about de-risking management teams, boards, governance. This board is ultimately going to have 9 members to start. At the moment, it's looking a lot like a Davos panel session, which is not necessarily bad. We do want people who have a lot of experience in helping organizations manage through chaos. On the other hand, we don't necessarily have women or people of color. And one of the challenges with artificial intelligence at this point is that we all know it's still quite riddled with bias. So I would argue that you can absolutely achieve a healthy margin while putting a lot of important safety concerns aside for the purpose of growing the company. And I'll just add one last thing. I was with some of the founders earlier in the year, and they were already at that point talking about OpenAI as an ecosystem, as a platform. And again, I'll just highlight, the real relationship that matters at the moment for these AI startups and tech companies is the cloud. One of the things that we're seeing is a race for cloud share. So as the ecosystems get built out, I think a lot of startups and companies that have made investments have to figure out where exactly they are in that value chain. Because if there are too many links away from the places where the decisions are being made, they have very little leverage going forward.
Yeah, all those key issues you brought up, Amy, certainly points to the infancy of the technology we're still looking at right now. Amy Webb, Future Today Institute CEO, and Sinan Aral, MIT Professor of Management, Marketing, IT, and Data Science. Good to have both of you on today. Really appreciate the time. We've got much more to come here on our special, The AI Divide. Stay tuned here. You're watching Yahoo Finance.
Boardroom chaos at OpenAI has highlighted the cracks in its corporate structure. But what about Microsoft? Even though Sam Altman is back at OpenAI, the tech giant might still be the winner. Shares of Microsoft spiked during the upheaval at OpenAI. Now, prior to Altman's return to OpenAI, Microsoft inviting the nonprofit's employees onto the Microsoft AI Lab team. So is Microsoft on its way to dominating the AI industry? For more on this, Brent Bracelin, Piper Sandler analyst, is here to tell us more. So talk about the strategy here. We saw Satya Nadella voicing his support for Sam going back to OpenAI and, continuing to support there. What is the strategy there as to how Microsoft still comes out on top?
Sure. Well, listen, it's been a very busy month with several new product launches, several user events where Microsoft is getting a buy-in for their first mover advantage in AI with really large enterprises. Accenture going wall to wall with GitHub Copilot powered by OpenAI and GPT-4. Large enterprises like Bayer and Shopify that are building their AI interfaces and functionality using Microsoft technology and OpenAI. So it is very critical as you think about Microsoft and this OpenAI relationship that they have a much better understanding of governance and controls and the opportunity. Things are happening very fast. There's a lot of excitement. Microsoft has this first mover advantage. But we've seen a little bit of risk here surface around the reliance around OpenAI and the structure there. Clearly, I think it was the right move for Microsoft to lend support over a very short period of time when the future of OpenAI was very uncertain. But ultimately, we do think that OpenAI and Microsoft are very, very close partners and will continue to be close partners. And we're certainly happy to see Sam and the team still together with minimal disruption to Microsoft's own AI ambitions.
Brent, with that said, this is a partnership that existed before the upheaval at OpenAI. Did anything fundamentally change for Microsoft over the last 5 days?
I think a lot has changed, right? I think one, it's exposed some additional risk, right, around Microsoft's reliance around GPT-4 and OpenAI, and so I think there's also some risk to the structure of working with basically this leading innovator in AI that Microsoft has put some money into, yet doesn't have a lot of governance and control over, and so I think that's certainly surfacing as something that needs to be addressed. So absolutely, Microsoft's learned a lot over the last 4 days. Investors have learned a lot over the last 4 days. Ultimately, if you put the drama aside, I think this is probably one of the better outcomes for Microsoft, particularly if you see them now start to have a board seat and more say in the governance of this operation going forward.
And what does this do in terms of their leadership position? I mean, we're already seeing Amazon, AWS investing $4 billion into Anthropic, some of these other AI competitors here. Does this perhaps, seeing some of that blood in the water, seeing some of that corporate governance, those issues there, does that potentially narrow the gap?
Listen, I think narrowing a gap in a 4-day period is certainly hard to do. I would just remind folks, we're very early in the evolution of this AI opportunity. We see Microsoft clearly as a first mover advantage here. They have about $2 billion run rate in AI. That is clearly far and away larger than any of their peers. I don't think they're going to narrow that gap in 4 days, but it's something to watch. By no means is Microsoft the only winner here. I think early days internet, there wasn't one winner of the internet. I think they're all going to look at different ways they can leverage this new technology and try to capitalize on it, leveraging their own internal strengths. Microsoft just happens to have a very bold vision of what they want to leverage here, what they want to do. And again, seeing stability at their partner OpenAI is really important.
Yeah, Brent, I mean, going back to what you just said about the risk that's been exposed for Microsoft over the last 5 days because of what you have said is the lack of governance that was at OpenAI, does that force Satya Nadella to maybe diversify a little? I mean, we've seen the close lock between these two companies, but a lot could have imploded if all these employees left at OpenAI.
on one hand, I think investors will press Microsoft to have some sort of diversification strategy. It's natural to have a multi-source relationship on silicon, multi-source relationships for multiple components. So that, I think, is something you're going to see investors lean in a little bit on. But I will go back. If you think about the role of AI and moving quickly, you're seeing Amazon starting to standardize, right, and work closer with Anthropic. Oracle with Oracle Cloud is partnering with Cohere. So I look at cloud and these AI, generative AI, and large language models as peanut butter and jelly. They go together. They're better together. You're going to have to make some choices because there are a limited number of options today. That will change in the next 10 years, but I think it is important to partner, and Microsoft has selected the partner here that happens to be the leader. And I think it's important that they continue that path, but absolutely over the next 10 years, longer term, they're going to have a more diversified strategy.
Well, it certainly helped the stock over the last 5 days. Investors happy about that. Brent Bracelin, Piper Sandler analyst, good to talk to you today.
Thank you.
We've got much more on all your markets action ahead, along with our special, The AI Divide. You're watching Yahoo Finance. OpenAI's ChatGPT took the world by storm a year ago and saw a flurry of tech companies eager to partner with the startup. Earlier this month, OpenAI reported 92% of Fortune 500 companies are currently using its products, with roughly 2 million. CEO Matt Calkins joins us with more on how he's been viewing the chaos that's played out over the last 5 days. I'd imagine, Matt, that you've sort of been watching from afar, maybe a little nervous to see what's going to happen within OpenAI, but how have you been making sense of what has transpired over the last 5 days?
Yeah, now, of course, I'm watching it from the outside. I'm not on the board, not inside these discussions. But what it seems like is we've just had a breakdown, a kind of a governance failure, a different point of view between management and the board. And I can totally see how this happens. You know, in our industry, the software industry, we've got a lot of talented, essential, and sometimes unpolished people. And the board's job is to educate, not necessarily to discipline, but to try to smooth the edges without killing the golden goose. I started Appian when I was 26, and it's possible that I tested the patience of my board a few times as well.
So when you look at the current board makeup now, some of the names that are still being thrown out here, does that make you feel better about this issue of balancing the risks of AI with also the growth of the technology?
Yeah, well, I do think that we have a chance to restart now. OpenAI, I don't think this weekend solved any of the problems. Whatever problems existed there, we've still got them. But we have a chance for a reset. The issues are on the table, and I think we've got the best possible way now to address them in a professional manner. So that's good. It does really say something though about this industry. OpenAI is a flagship in AI, and we've had a close glimpse inside of how they work in the past few days. We see they're less than 1,000 people. We see that they've got this kind of a disagreement, this conflict between the board and the governance, that maybe nothing's perfect. It's really interesting to see what an absolute leader in AI looks like right now. And I think it's a signal to the rest of us that this is a growing and not necessarily a very mature industry in a lot of ways. This is what the bleeding edge looks like.
Matt, it's tough to believe that it's just been a year since the world has been introduced to ChatGPT. But talk to me about how Appian integrates OpenAI's technology and why that was a partnership that made sense for you. Has that idea shifted?
Yeah, it's been just a year. It's amazing. I think it was a year ago today that it broke out. We use OpenAI thoroughly in our product. And speaking not just for Appian here, but for our industry generally, the combination of generative AI and process automation is a beautiful thing. We could take a form and turn that form automatically into an application, collecting all the data, routing it to the right place, handling it like a case. It's amazing what you can do when generative AI is turned toward building a process, not just textual output. We also use it as a co-pilot to help you develop applications. We use it as a way to query vast volumes of text in order to understand their meaning quickly. The marriage of process automation and AI, specifically OpenAI's generative technology, has been extraordinarily productive.
But Matt, when you have a visionary CEO who literally the workforce is willing to move with him if he was going to move, if the board didn't get its act together, what does that mean in terms of the potential for perhaps diversifying or even developing your own in-house that doesn't rely on ChatGPT and OpenAI?
Well, look, as much as I admire what OpenAI has done, I think it's essential that every organization diversify their dependence on AI. You've seen here that these organizations that create the very cutting edge concepts are fluid, right? That they're subject to change. And so at Appian, we have partnerships with many AI providers, and we use the technology from many of them in our product. I think that's just prudent for any organization that's making a big bet on AI today.
And Matt, there's certainly a debate that's happening within AI about whether, in fact, this should be open source, whether this should be developed privately, how much transparency should exist. Kind of talk to me about how you're thinking about it and how you've kind of shifted, or whether, in fact, you have, as a result of what's played out at OpenAI.
Yeah. All right. Well, the privacy question comes down to safety. And I think a lot of the reason why a lot of people want to get inside how AI is being developed is because they want to be sure it's kept safe. And I understand that had something to do with this weekend's events as well, concerns about how worried we all are about safety. I think that the proposal to have the government look into red team data that came out of the White House a couple of weeks ago was a constructive first, very, very small and not particularly effective step, but it's a step. This obvious avenue. The way to keep AI safe is not by limiting who can be trained to create these AI models, right? If you don't want it to be used to make a data say, it's just too powerful for that. But I do think that we should be focusing on what data goes in. The obligation of AI is merely to anonymize the data, the personal data that's of the people who create information or who are worried about their own privacy. We should instead expect the government to take the lead and to protect people who they can get every information, they will take copyright information and train. Government needs to take the lead. Industry doesn't want that.
But Matt, is it now policymakers trying to put that genie back in the bottle? Has the horse already left the barn at this point?
No, it has not. No, there's still an open issue as to whether AI, right? There's a lawsuit out there with a couple hundred authors signed on saying AI got trained on. I think that this is going to come to the judicial system immediately, and it might as well come to our legislative branch as well. We need to think about who owns what data and whether AI use of that data is an infringement.
We know we certainly haven't heard the last of that. I'm sure more lawsuits, as we've also seen with musicians as well, coming to the fray. Appreciate that breakdown. Yes. Matt Calkins, Appian founder and CEO. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
All right, we'll have more on our Yahoo Finance special, The AI Divide, on the other side of this break. Stay tuned. Altman is back as OpenAI's CEO, but the mood has shifted. Investors are keeping an eye on the broader landscape as governments lag behind the evolving tech, from Biden's new executive order to the EU's AI Act. So what's next in the road to regulation? Let's bring in former FDIC Chief Innovation Officer and Duke Professor Sultan Meghji and Axios technology reporter Ashley Gold to discuss more. Thank you for joining us this morning. Sultan, I want to kick things off with you. What does this open up for regulators? We essentially had what could have been an acquisition without an acquisition if Altman had stayed at Microsoft. What do you think regulators will be focusing on with this wake-up call?
Oh, this is an incredible issue, right? Because one of the things we're struggling with on the regulatory side is understanding the impact of AI and how to keep the centralization issues that happened with social media, that happened with 5G, that happened with cloud, and now with broader big tech issues. This just looks like another way to get past the regulatory landscape. There are a lot of conversations here in DC about, well, we didn't have that issue this time, but what if this had happened? And so it absolutely will be on the minds of regulators.
Ashley, what are you hearing from your sources about how lawmakers, policymakers who have been trying to come up with some kind of framework for these guardrails, how they've been watching these developments?
Absolutely. So in Washington, it's Thanksgiving week and lawmakers tend to be a little more quiet during that week. I was hoping to talk to more of them over the weekend. But what we heard specifically from Senator Mark Warner and a couple others is that this turmoil at the top of OpenAI just goes to show that there needs to be rules of the road from the government in place to make sure AI is safe for people and is working for the best of humanity, no matter who is at the helm of these big companies. The lawmakers like Sam Altman, he's made a good impression on them in his trips to Washington. But this shakeup is quite telling that maybe at the top here there's disagreement over how far this technology should go. And I think when Congress ramps back up after Thanksgiving, we're going to be hearing a lot more about that.
And Ashley, on that point about what this policy could look like, there's a few templates on the table, right? There's the bill from Josh Hawley, Richard Blumenthal. There's also the executive order that's on the table too. Where's the consensus right now? Is it about transparency? Is it about sharing, sort of the red teaming? Like where are you hearing about where this is likely to go and likely to pass?
So I would say that there is still not a ton of agreement on the broad contours of AI regulation, but where we are seeing some agreement come up is transparency. Like you said, people want explainability. They want to know how these algorithms work. They want to know when what they're seeing is generated by AI versus a human. So that transparency part is something that everybody agrees on. There's also agreement that only the sort of biggest, most complicated, most dangerous advanced models are the ones that should be highly regulated. There is a sense that smaller AI companies that are doing AI models that aren't quite as impactful should not be caught up in the same regulations as these foundation models that OpenAI and others are working on. So I think that's a bit of a lesson we learned from the social media era, that it is not one size fits all when it comes to regulating technology, and companies of different sizes have different needs. So there's a lot of discussion about sort of the right sizing these regulations.
So Sultan, to that point then, should it be about a large framework that sort of oversees everything, or sort of building on the existing laws to protect when it comes to the sort of data that's being mined, consumer protection? Is that a way to sort of stay on top of it as the technology itself races ahead?
Now, given the likelihood of Congress passing anything reasonable is somewhere between 0 and a negative number, we're going to have to make use of the existing laws and the existing interpretations. The challenge is they're exclusively based on risk, right? And they're not based on the capabilities or the impacts. And so it's sort of like saying I have a regulation that works on a fax machine, therefore I'm going to apply it to email. It probably is good for the next year, maybe 2 years, but at some point Congress will have to start doing something to actually pass laws. The other challenge here is that if foundational model is kind of a misnomer. There are dozens of companies that are very small, that are not publicly traded, that don't sit in front of the White House, that are fundamentally reshaping, for example, biotechnology or the markets. And so this notion of a framework based on size or scale of AI model is not going to work in this case, because the most impactful artificial intelligence companies aren't the ones in the news this week or last week or even for years. And so the way that it's being thought about, even inside of the regulatory frameworks, is going to miss a lot. And we're going to see issues over the next few years without a more comprehensive set of laws passed by Congress.
Sultan, when you think about these big tech names, you mentioned Microsoft, obviously been in the headlines, but Google, I mean, they have been under scrutiny from regulators for other issues, antitrust specifically. Microsoft, yes, they were under scrutiny for the Activision acquisition, but they've largely escaped some of that, partly because they've been in close conversation with these regulators. Yeah. I wonder if you think what has transpired over the last 5 days, that puts them right back in the center, the crosshairs of regulators, because in many ways it points to the sheer scale, the power, the money that Microsoft has in betting on this very technology.
Absolutely. I mean, Microsoft has put just $10 billion into OpenAI and has the ability to fundamentally change what the board decided in 5 days with a couple of phone calls. And I think it does reframe how a lot of people are going to think about this. And whether it's Microsoft in particular or the big tech companies writ large, we're going to be in a situation, I'm positive, where the output of the last 5 days of chaos at OpenAI will fundamentally shift the regulatory lens back to the big tech companies that are writing these checks. And now, coming out of this process of 5 days, previous to this, Microsoft did not have a board seat. They were not even board observers at OpenAI. It's very clear that they will. And so now there's a new regulatory concern. And I think an antitrust discussion is going to end up happening no matter what.
So Ashley, if we're going to end up having this antitrust conversation, then what does that mean for some of these innovators? As you've mentioned and Sultan mentioned, it's a lot of these smaller innovators flying under the radar who perhaps aren't catching the eye of regulators. So how do you think regulations will proceed from here? What are some of the most promising legislations that you're seeing?
So in the past couple of years, we've had Congress making a valiant attempt to update the antitrust laws for the digital age, with the American Innovation and Competition Online Act, a couple of App Store bills. Those bills made it pretty far in Congress, but they did not make it over the finish line. Where we've seen most of the action has been in the courts and in the federal agencies. You've got ongoing tech antitrust cases at the Justice Department and at the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission has promised to look at OpenAI as well. So I think, like the other panelist was saying about Congress moving very slowly, that where we're going to see the most action is in these federal agencies and in courts. We have to see who ends up filing a lawsuit, and that is where we're going to see most of the action when it comes to antitrust in the coming years. I think that we're shifting toward a war going.
Sultan, we haven't necessarily talked about sort of the do you think that continues? You think they move forward a little more cautiously? I mean, give me the pulse on that, because you've got a good vision on that side too.
I think for the last, let's say, 12 months, especially since the release of Chat, anything and everything. I mean, a few years before that, we saw the same group of people investing in organizations like that. A lot of the venture capital firms out there that are investing are really getting back to basics and saying, is the thing I'm investing in structured the right way? Does it have the right governance model? Does it have a board of directors that's a credible governance mechanism? Do they have product? Do they have algorithm? Do they understand the regulatory landscape? Do they understand these various discussions that we're having here? And I think we're going to see an evolution away from, these massive checks for PowerPoint presentations, frankly, turning to something that's a little more meaningful. Firms that are going off to raise right now, and their investments may or may not have shown promise or shown any sort of delivery. Most venture firms, even if they say they're 6 or 7 year funds, really are trying in 3 years to give your investors their money back. You're not in a situation where, you can really trust that the market inertia is going to take that value up now. You're in a situation where it comes down to basics. Are they selling? Are they making money? Do they have sticky customers? The normal, I'd call it bread and butter of venture capital. So
legislation that we've seen has been in reaction to developments from countries like China and their high tech, and in Congress to when they see that perhaps this is something they need to be getting ahead of as other countries pull forward that don't have that same red tape to get through.
That's a great question. You look at Europe, which is moving very quickly on regulatory with kind of less AI, and the US is kind of in the middle. The question is going to be, the balancing act between, letting innovation move at the pace of innovation or, slowing it down through some sort of regulatory evolution. And, the US has always kind of lived in the middle of those two worlds. And right now we're seeing that represented politically, with one party being very much in favor of one and the other being very much in favor of the other. You can figure out who that is. And out of that, we're going to be in a situation where over the next 12 to 18 months, I'm hopeful we'll get to consensus, but I'm not sure we are, because the economic impetus is still on, like it was 30 years ago when I got started. It's fundamentally based on, do you make money?
And feels like conversations in so many industries, to what extent does that speed things up? Is this kind of a wake-up call, if you will, that they've got to move quicker, because they didn't necessarily do that with other issues like social media and crypto?
It absolutely is a wake-up call, and I think you really saw that momentum moving when the Biden administration rolled out their AI executive order shortly before the Global AI Summit in the UK, where Vice President Kamala Harris was there with Rishi Sunak and other world leaders, and they really wanted to get something out there before the summit to say, hey, here's what the US is doing. Here's our approach. And we think it's the best approach when it comes to balancing innovation and also, reeling in the possible most dangerous behavior. And we want everyone to be reminded that the top AI companies are American, and we want them to continue to be supported and grow here and not feel stifled. However, we're still looking out for safety. So the White House has been very careful about sort of towing that line and making sure that message gets across on the global stage. They have indicated that they think the EU has moved too quickly and that they cannot let China be the leader on this either for obvious reasons. So that is the line they've been towing.
Okay, we'll be watching to see how things move from here. Ashley Gold, Axios technology reporter, and Sultan Megji, former chief innovation officer, federal FDIC Duke professor, venture capitalist. Good to talk to both of you today. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
It's been a tumultuous 5 days for the AI space, with Sam Altman's abrupt ouster from OpenAI and now reinstatement. And Rochelle, we've been listening to some of these experts over the last hour. I will tell you, as somebody from the outside looking in, following this technology as a reporter, I'm not sure I walk away from this conversation any more comfortable that things are being developed at a slow pace that ensures the safety of AI, especially after all the warnings that we have gotten from these very founders about AI's potential over the last year.
And I think that's what it really speaks to, because it's the same voices. It's the Elon Musks, it's the Sam Altmans really decrying the risks of where AI could go, while at the same time pushing for more development. I believe we're now in that ChatGPT 4 or 5 at this point, looking at even larger language models, basically looking at a lot of unknowns at this point. And then you add this shakeup at this company at the center of it all, Microsoft in there, hedging its bets as well. Satya Nadella, at least for now, supporting this move, really playing the long game here. It still remains to be seen how Microsoft is really going to capitalize on it. But it really does speak to generative AI being the sort of battleground in the tech space. Even when you look at some of the investments, you're seeing NVIDIA, also one of the big front runners when it comes to investing in generative AI. And we've talked about diversifying in this space. So what this means for Microsoft, for the Googles, for the Amazons. And then something interesting that a lot of guests were bringing up is the partnership between cloud and generative AI. And so you have the opportunity here for even more exponential growth, while regulators still getting caught on the back foot, Akiko.
Yeah, and it's worth sort of taking a step back to explain to those who haven't necessarily followed the story about why there's been so much attention on OpenAI and ChatGPT. I was looking through the numbers here earlier this month. You had Sam Altman saying that ChatGPT had over 100 million weekly active users. So a year on from its release, it is being much more widely used. It's growing much more quickly. And that's why there's been so much focus on that. Regulation is certainly going to be key for this space moving forward. I'd imagine, Rochelle, we're going to be talking about that a lot in the months ahead.